Sean Diddy Combs has just filed a brand new bid to get out of jail before his sentencing in a few months. From arguing he shouldn't be locked up for his swinger lifestyle, to highlighting the atrocious conditions at the MDC, to addressing allegations of violence, he is fighting for his life in this new letter to the judge.
Diddy had just been declared guilty. The word echoed like thunder through the courtroom, a single crushing syllable that shattered decades of denial and ripped apart the illusion of untouchable power. A shockwave surged beyond those walls, its impact already reaching far past the courthouse steps. The jurors, who had spent weeks dissecting testimony and evidence, looked visibly shaken, as though the weight of their decision had finally settled on their shoulders.
Will Sean Diddy Combs be released from jail? I know I've asked that question before so many different times here on Sidebar, but we have right now a brand new request from his legal team, a brand new filing from his defense team arguing for why he should be released now after that monumental verdict in his criminal case several weeks ago. The circumstances have changed, and I will tell you what, we did an interview a few weeks back that kind of previewed why and how Combs could be released. It was a bail bondsman that is apparently working with Diddy's team behind the scenes. I'm going to get to that a little bit later. But what I want to talk about right now is this latest letter from the defense to the judge overseeing this case, Judge Arun Subramanian. Remember, this comes after a jury of Combs' peers found him not guilty of racketeering conspiracy, not guilty of 2 counts of sex trafficking, but they did convict him of 2 counts of transportation to engage in prostitution. He's set to be sentenced on October 3rd. Technically, he could face up to 10 years in prison on each charge. Highly unlikely. Think maybe you might be looking at somewhere to 2 to 5 years potentially, but he could also get time served and be released, although that also seems unlikely. I'll talk about that a little bit later too. But initially, after the verdict, right after the verdict, his defense team petitioned the court that he should be released. He was just acquitted of some very serious charges. The judge denied it. The judge denied Combs bail once again. And remember, this comes after he was rejected bail multiple times since he was arrested back in September of 2024, highlighting the severity of the charges, the violence, and so forth. But now, this is different. Now, what is the defense arguing? I'm going to go over all this in the new letter. I'm going to give my take at the end about whether or not it's going to be successful and whether or not he will actually be released before sentencing in October. So, the defense begins by arguing that Sean Combs should be released in advance of sentencing, and the court has the power to do this. They have the authority, among other things, because you can clearly show, quote, that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. So, what are those exceptions? What are those reasons? What are those circumstances that are exceptional? They highlight several things that we're going to get into. That the charges he was convicted of, we're going to call them the Mann Act violations. That's what it's called under the law. They're not as severe, they're not as egregious as other convictions in other cases. That the sheer fact that he's locked up at the MDC, the Metropolitan Detention Center, for the past 11 months, that in and of itself is a reason for him to be released. These are all exceptional circumstances, and I'm going to get into all the arguments. But first, they highlight the standard, and they argue that to be released under federal law, you need to show 2 conditions. First, the district court must find by clear and convincing evidence that the person is not likely to flee or pose a danger to the safety of any other person or the community if released. Second, it must be clearly shown that there are exceptional reasons why such person's detention would not be appropriate. Now, clear and convincing evidence is a lower standard, by the way. It's not like beyond a reasonable doubt. Anyway, basically, you have to show he's not a flight risk, he's not a danger, and you have to show there are particular, exceptional, unique reasons for why detaining Combs is wrong. We're going to start with the exceptional reasons justifying his release. And they begin by trying to define, well, what exactly is exceptional circumstances? What does that mean? And they argue that case law suggests a court has a lot of discretion to determine whether a particular set of circumstances qualifies as exceptions. And they say, look, Sean Combs, his case, so different from other ones. There has never been, according to them, a Mann Act prosecution like this one before. And this is how they lay it out. Quote, there has literally never been a case like this one, where a person and his girlfriend arrange for adult men to have consensual sexual relations with the adult long-term girlfriend as part of a demonstrated swingers lifestyle and has been prosecuted and incarcerated under the Mann Act. Combs and 2 of his longtime girlfriends had a private, intimate life that is not uncommon today.
Victims in the gallery sat frozen, eyes wide, emotions flickering across their faces like lightning. Reporters scrambled to blast out the headline. Courtroom artists dropped their pencils in disbelief. And then, at the very center of it all, Diddy stood up. Not slowly, not cautiously, but like a man who still believed he was in charge. Hands clenched, chest puffed, and then he exploded. "I demand to be released. This is outrageous," he shouted, voice booming with fury. An actual outburst from Sean Diddy Combs in open court, moments after a guilty verdict. For a split second, no one moved. The judge blinked once. The prosecution stayed frozen. The bailiff instinctively edged closer to the bench, and then the murmurs began. Low whispers, exchanged glances. Some faces mirrored disbelief. Others weren't shocked at all. Because if anyone was going to blow up after being declared guilty, it was Diddy.
Threesomes. Miss Ventura consistently expressed interest and enthusiasm in her intimate life with Combs, including what they called freak-offs. Jane and Sean Combs had threesomes too. When Jane and Combs watched pornography together, Jane testified that she contacted 2 different porn stars and invited them to join her and Mr. Combs. Both Miss Ventura and Jane testified that very often they would see the same men over and over again for years. In July of 2024, Jane testified, for instance, that she suggested to Mr. Combs that they call Paul. Jane explained that she told Combs she, quote, missed Paul. When asked why she said that, she responded, "Because I did." This was a lifestyle, one that both Miss Ventura and Jane chose, one they all, as grown adults, had a right to choose. Like many aspects of sex and intimacy, it was not without its complications, its bouts of jealousy, and at times, its frustrations. But that is a hallmark of any serious romantic relationship, and that is what these were, serious, long-term romantic relationships. By the way, not surprising they're really focusing on this because, again, he was acquitted of sex trafficking. They highlight how the jury didn't find sex trafficking of Jane or Cassie, that it didn't occur. There was no force, fraud, or coercion that was used to induce these women to engage in commercial sex acts. For transportation to engage in prostitution, what he was convicted of, the prosecution didn't have to prove that violence was used or that fraud was used or threats were used. It was just, did you transport these women and men for the purposes of sex work, commercial sex acts? And obviously the jury convicted him of that. And they highlight all the jury found was that there was prostitution, payment of porn stars and escorts. And they highlight that he is a swinger, or under the Mann Act, a John. And they argue he doesn't deserve to be locked up for this. Quote, Sean Combs should not be in jail for this conduct. In fact, he may be the only person currently in a United States jail for being any sort of John, and certainly the only person in jail for hiring adult male escorts for him and his girlfriend when he did not even have sex with the escort himself. Over the last 75 years, the White Slave Traffic Act has been limited to defendants who cause interstate travel for financial gain through the business of prostitution. That Sean Combs remains in jail for being convicted of being a customer of consensual adult sex services makes this case truly exceptional. Not only is prosecuting the users of adult prostitution services inconsistent with the Mann Act, it's inconsistent with the prosecution policies of the district attorneys of Manhattan and the city attorney of Los Angeles, California, 2 of the 3 locations where this prostitution allegedly took place. In addition, Mr. Combs is incarcerated while everyone else involved in this identical conduct, his girlfriends, the cowboys, the agency leaders, the porn stars, and others, walk free, as they should. If there was ever a fact pattern that was exceptional under the Mann Act, it is this one. And then they move on to another argument, that the Department of Justice, the DOJ, has usually only charged Mann Act violations when there's financial gain. And they even cite a number of cases in the Southern District of New York, where Combs was prosecuted, that apparently involved defendants that set up a prostitution business for profit.
"I have rights," he barked again, jabbing a trembling finger at the prosecution. "You all know this is personal. You know this is political. This isn't justice. This is a setup." The gallery gasped. One of the victims, a woman who had testified for more than 2 hours during the trial, quietly looked away. Her hands shook, but she didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The verdict had already said everything. Court officers began moving toward Diddy, slow and deliberate. Their training kicked in. This wasn't the time for panic. This was the time for control. Because what they were witnessing wasn't just a courtroom disruption. It was the collapse of a myth. Diddy's lawyers scrambled to contain it. One leaned in close, whispering urgently in his ear. Another rose to address the judge. Your Honor, Mr. Combs is understandably emotional. We request a brief recess to allow him to collect himself. But the judge wasn't playing that game.
Again, trying to distinguish between Combs' conduct and these cases. He never did any of this for profit, they argued. And they even cite the 1953 U.S. Attorney's Manual that says, quote, as a general rule, prosecution should not be instituted in the so-called non-commercial cases. And they claim the Department of Justice manual today, quote, makes clear that the prosecution of customers involved in an 18 U.S.C. 2421 offense, like Mr. Combs here, is now limited to prosecuting those who engage in commercial sex with victims of sex trafficking, in addition to those who otherwise perpetrate or facilitate human trafficking offenses. And in the absence of any sex trafficking charge, however, it is clear that the standalone Mann Act counts never would have been prosecuted. That seems true. I think you ask any legal expert, they will say if all the government had against Sean Combs was the transportation to engage in prostitution charges, just the prostitution charges, they probably wouldn't have gone after him. They coupled it with racketeering and they coupled it with sex trafficking. I agree with that. I don't think that they would have gone after him just for that. Anyway, the defense highlights how modern day prosecutions of Johns is really when you're talking about exploiting vulnerable foreigners who don't speak English well, which again is not the case here. And they highlight how the only potentially comparable case in New York is where you had a retired police officer and a former judge who apparently hired women to have sex with a male fraternal group called the Jesters. But Combs' attorneys say, while there was no profit there, there's no profit here, there was sex trafficking of those prostitutes. That's what's different. Again, Combs was acquitted of sex trafficking in this case. And here's the main point, quote, moreover, the cases which involve defendants similarly situated to Mr. Combs have been released on bond pending sentencing. In reviewing the cases across the country where the primary or sole conviction was for a violation of 18 U.S.C. 2421, the defendants who were not charged with running a prostitution business have been released pending sentencing. And then Combs' attorneys make another argument for why Combs' conditions are exceptional. And it's about him being locked up at the MDC. They say that a district court judge in the Southern District in another case basically said how bad the MDC is. As Judge Furman noted, the state of affairs at MDC is unacceptable. In so noting, Judge Furman concluded that the conditions in the MDC qualify as exceptional reasons under the statute justifying, and this was the defendant in this case, Chavez's continuing release. Judge Furman found that the conditions at the MDC are, quote, dreadful in many respects, but three warrant particular emphasis. 1. Continued reports of inordinate periods of lockdown. 2. Claims that the facility provides inadequate and or substantially delayed necessary medical care, a particular risk in this case, and 3, general issues about the conditions at the facility. These conditions have not abated in Mr. Combs' detention at the facility. As the court is aware, during Mr. Combs' incarceration at the MDC, the facility was subject to an interagency sweep that was designed to achieve our shared goal of maintaining a safe environment for both our employees and the incarcerated individuals housed at MDC Brooklyn. They're actually quoting what the rationale was. In other words, there is a
Mr. Combs, the judge said, voice sharp, firm, and utterly cold. This courtroom will not tolerate disorder. You will compose yourself immediately, or you will be removed. But Diddy wasn't done. This is a joke, he muttered, pacing. Now, you're destroying my life. You're destroying everything I built. And that's when it became painfully clear to everyone in the room. He still didn't get it. This wasn't about what he built. This was about what he broke. He had. Broken people, broken lives, burying the damage beneath money, NDAs, and PR campaigns. He had built walls of silence. But now those walls had come crashing down. Even in that moment, cuffed by truth, Diddy still believed he could talk his way out. The prosecution, silent until now, stepped forward. "Your Honor," the lead prosecutor said, measured and fierce. "This outburst confirms our position. This defendant should be taken into custody immediately. He has shown he will not accept the authority of this court. He cannot be trusted to respect the legal process. He is not entitled to negotiate his own consequences." She paused, the weight of her words settling like ice. Remand him, now.
For being violent to them.
Well, he was. Because force, fraud, or coercion.
Forced to stay in the relationship.
But
forced to do the freak offs.
But Charles,
and he wasn't convicted of that.
No, I know.
Right.
But there was testimony that that Jane and Cassie were assaulted by Diddy. But
correct.
And had the jury believed that, they could have found him guilty.
Not necessarily. He can be assaulting them, but the jury didn't believe that they were forced to stay in this relationship, right? The jury essentially said they were getting plenty out of this relationship, and that's why we're not going to convict him.
Look, the bottom line is they didn't convict him
You guys
of
are arguing
violence.
the wrong point. The Mann Act, under the bail statute, you can argue what you think the law should be. Here's what the law is. Under the bail statute, it is considered a violent crime. We can say it doesn't include violent. The Mann Act, 18 U.S.C. 2421, prohibits the transportation of individuals across state lines for prostitution and other immoral purposes. This is called a crime of violence when determining whether to detain a defendant on bail.
Right, on bail.
Counsel, wait a second. He just dropped code on you. He had the actual.
He's asking for bail.
No, but the judge didn't allow bail for $1 million.
I know.
They were willing to put $1 million up. And by the way, you know as well as I know that and I'm not defending Diddy here. All I'm saying is, no, I'm not. I mean, Diddy should have been convicted in California.
Hold on.
But what I'm saying is, the Mann Act is not a violent crime.
I know what you're saying. I get it.
It's not.
But the judge has to go by the code.
So is this about amount? Is this about amount?
It's not about amount. So
it says on bail. It says on bail.
Once the violent crime, the defendant, the convicted defendant, has to prove by a preponderance of the evidence or convince the judge one of two things. Either, both, he's not a flight risk. The judge did not weigh not letting him out on him being a flight risk. There's no real evidence he's a flight risk, and that's what the money would go to. Is he willing to leave $50 million behind? He has an ankle monitor.
Right.
He's not really a flight risk.
Surrenders passport, too.
Surrenders passport. The other thing that Diddy has to show, the burden is on Diddy, is that he is not likely to commit the same violent act, the Mann Act, again. Diddy, remember, even though he knew he was under federal surveillance, even though he was about to be arrested, was conducting a freak-off.
So what you're saying is they will keep him behind bars pending sentencing because they're afraid he might have a freak-off with a prostitute.
Correct. He might traffic in prostitutes.
Actually,
right. And they hold him without bail. There are people who kill people who get out on bail. Again, I'm just saying what's right is right. And there are people who kill people who get out on bail after they are convicted.
Are you convinced that Diddy will not engage in a freak-off? I think he probably would.
Can I just say, if there's a freak-off where there is no violence, force, or coercion, I mean, do you care that much? Do you care?
I personally don't care. The law says what it says.
And that's why they don't prosecute under the Mann Act.
Look.
Because people don't care. They never would have prosecuted him if this was just a Mann Act violation. The only reason they prosecuted him was because of Cassie and Jane.
Right. The video came out of Cassie.
That's right.
That's why they prosecuted. Let's not forget, though, and the judge remarked
Can we just
on this.
call BS?
The judge looked at Diddy, then at the prosecution, then back at the defense team, who now looked completely out of their depth. Remanded, the judge said. No drama, just finality. That one word was the end of everything Diddy thought he controlled. Court officers moved in with purpose now. This wasn't a warning anymore. It was execution. Diddy's lawyers tried to speak again, but the officers were already beside him. No, Diddy snapped, pulling away instinctively. You don't get to do this. But yes, they did. And they were. The cuffs came out. Click, click, game over. The man who once owned stages, dominated boardrooms, commanded press conferences, and dictated cultural taste was now being escorted out of a courtroom as a convicted criminal. He didn't speak again. The energy in the room shifted. Chaos bled into control. Noise dissolved into silence. Because what had just happened wasn't merely a celebrity being found guilty. It was a system refusing to be manipulated. Outside the courthouse, the world was on fire. Reporters shoved microphones toward anyone breathing. Twitter, no, the entire internet, was detonating. Headlines flashed by the second, social feeds melting in real time. Diddy remanded after courtroom meltdown. Outburst after guilty verdict. Shocks nation, court says no more. Diddy taken into custody. Every outlet, every platform, every camera locked in. But inside,
employees and incarcerated individuals that require outside law enforcement action from multiple agencies to address. Importantly, MDC, as a jail, has a significant law enforcement presence within its walls 24 hours per day that are equipped with investigatory and often unregulated authority. Thus, the requirement of outside law enforcement agencies to ensure safety within the MDC is an admission that serious violence, mayhem, and chaos is occurring within the MDC that requires more than a Band-Aid raid, but rather surgery. Indeed, we are aware of ongoing threats of violence and actual violence in the facility such that Mr. Combs' safety is constantly at risk. And they go on to argue, though Mr. Combs has been a model inmate for his nearly year-long period of confinement, the violent conditions are still very much a concern for Mr. Combs and is an unnecessary confinement risk given the clear precedent of multiple similarly situated Mann Act convictions where defendants were released on conditions. Now, the government, by the way, would probably disagree with that statement of him being a model inmate. Remember when they accused Combs of trying to arrange three-way phone calls and buying the use of other inmates' phone privileges to try to make sure the government wasn't listening in, that he was having these private conversations, that he was allegedly trying to contact witnesses in the case, that he allegedly orchestrated a birthday campaign to help his public image while he was locked up. So if we hear a government response, I'm sure they're going to say something about that. Then the defense highlights he's not a risk of flight. He's not a danger to the community, which, by the way, I think are real key points here. But they seem to echo a lot of the same arguments that they have already stated to the court. And remember, they haven't been successful in the past. That he voluntarily came to New York last year to surrender himself to authorities, that he gave up his passport to his attorneys 6 months before his arrest, paid off his mortgage on his Miami home so it was free and clear for him to stay at while out on bond. He was just acquitted of the most serious charges that he was facing, which, by the way, carried decades, if not life in prison, that he's not a risk of flight. That's the basic argument. Now, when it comes to the danger argument, that is key. Why? Judge Subramanian had said after the verdict that the reason he was denying bail was because of Combs' violence, that his own attorneys admitted he was violent during the course of the trial. Well, here is what Combs' defense attorneys argue about that. Quote, the court noted that the defense admitted a history of domestic violence as to Miss Ventura and that he struck Jane twice in June 2024. However, we strenuously object that Mr. Combs...
That courthouse, there was only one reality. He was gone. The seat he occupied now empty. His defense team sat in silence, papers in hand, but with no more moves left to play. The prosecution, calm, quiet. The look of a storm that had passed but left. A path of truth behind it. And the victims, some cried, some smiled, some simply closed their eyes. But they all knew what this moment meant. That the silence they endured for years, sometimes decades, was finally over. That the power structure that had once crushed their voices had been cracked. That they weren't crazy. That the truth had won. Diddy's outburst had said everything. He wasn't sorry. He wasn't humble. He wasn't remorseful. He was furious that the machine he built couldn't save him. That the illusion of power he wore like armor had shattered. But there was no walking out now. No bail, no PR statement, no rebranding campaign. This was real. He demanded release. But the court gave him reality, and reality doesn't negotiate. Now he sits waiting. Not in a suite, not in a mansion, not on a yacht. In a holding cell. No studio, no cameras, just 4 walls. And the truth? The same truth he tried to bury with money, fame, and fear. But it rose anyway. And now he answers to it. Because when the verdict drops and the cuffs close and the doors lock, there is no more brand, no more fame, no more legacy, just justice. And for Diddy, that moment came the second he demanded release and was met with a cold, permanent, no. Game over, Jess.